Okay, we've made quite a bit of progress since we started, and I would like to take a little bit of time to discuss atrioventricular blocks with you. Now, if I give you this first rhythm here, I'm going to start out, we're going to draw, and like I said, bear with my chicken scratch here a little bit. I run into problems if I start trying to draw things a little too slow. So essentially, if you look at this, take a few seconds, look at the different characteristics, QRS, P waves, and so forth, and pause the video here, and then let's walk through this as a group or together. So you've got QRS is narrow. P waves are upright, round, and relatively symmetric. I'll admit that they're hand-drawn, so they're not perfectly consistent, but you get the idea. They're pretty consistent on here. So, hand-drawn rhythms on here, it's relatively consistent looking P waves. PR ratio is a 1-to-1. Now, if you look, you can start getting a little bit picky and right in here, well, that looks like maybe there's another P wave. Again, I hand draw these, so I'm going to kind of walk you through this because I want you to understand the process, and then we'll take a little bit of time at the end here and look at some real generated rhythms on this so that you get a chance to see it better. But it's important for me to walk you through this process and show you how the rhythms are generated, because that, in my experience, has really done a good job of teaching people how to read these rhythms. If you look at this, though, that looks very different from this. Whereas this one, that has pretty much a point to it, and most all the rest of these, this one has a little bit of a point to it. Most of the rest of these P waves are all pretty much round. Now, this is something that's going to come from practice. This is where you're going to need to delve into your textbook. I get comments back and forth, why do we buy this textbook? We don't have assignments out of here. We don't hardly ever read it. The reality on that textbook is you really do need to have another voice. You need to have another way of understanding how these rhythms are generated and have a ready reference in that respect. I know the videos you can go back and replay multiple times, but you're still just getting one perspective on how these rhythms are generated. So having mine and getting review and lecture, and then also having the textbook, give you multiple ways of looking at these different rhythms. So practicing, you're going to find what things look like a P wave versus what does not look like a P wave. And if you look, I've basically got a 1-to-1 PR ratio. Every time I have a P wave, I have a QRS. Every time I have a QRS, I have a P wave. So this is a 1-to-1 PR ratio. I had some questions that have come in here. Well, what happens if it gets clipped right off at the beginning? And just to draw a very quick example on this, if the rhythm starts out like this, and we'll say it continues on, but if you take a look right at the very beginning here, I have a QRS, but there's no P wave. So technically on this rhythm, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 QRSs, and I only have 3 P waves, so it's not a 1-to-1. That's not true. If the beginning is clipped off, I can't see what would have happened here. I would expect there to be a P wave. You can't make a judgment based on what you think might have happened before here. As we're going to be learning with this session here, with these combinations of the different blocks, we start looking to see, are there things missing in the middle of the rhythm? Likewise, if this were to come over, and it's going to be a little sloppy because I'm drawing on this, but let's just say for a second here that that didn't happen. Now we've got P waves here, but now I've got an extra P wave, and it gets clipped off at the end. Well, I would expect there would be a QRS here, but I can't see it. So you can't judge that there's not a QRS when you can't actually see what happens. So I realize that raised some confusion, and I know we wanted to go over that in the lecture and discuss it, but I figured it was just as good a time as any for review. So let me go ahead and clear that out, and we're going to go back to our original rhythm. QRSs are narrow, P waves are upright, PR ratio is 1-to-1. Now, PR interval, this is something that's going to be important, and I apologize because I can draw these things on a whiteboard really, really well, and I appreciate your patience bearing with me as I get through this, and I'm drawing these on the Blackboard system here on YouTube. But if you look, the PR interval here is pretty consistent. I'll stipulate, yeah, that one looks maybe a little longer than that one. Most of these are pretty consistent though. So maybe one's a tiny bit longer. The reality though is, again, when I'm hand drawing the rhythms, they might have some slight anomalies here, but as a rule, the PR interval is essentially the same. I don't have one PR interval like that and one PR interval that's like that. I mean, I don't have these really, really huge discrepancies in PR intervals. So it's essentially consistent PR intervals. That becomes extremely important starting with this session here with the AV blocks. And if we looked at this, you would need to measure this against the graph paper. The PR interval is supposed to be, fill in the blank, 3 to 5 small blocks. So it should be from the start of the P wave to the start of the QRS, it should be at least 3, but no more than 5, or 120 to 200 milliseconds, 0.12 to 0.20 seconds. And I will tell you that when I'm hand drawing rhythms, I tend to try and exaggerate things for simple purposes here. If you looked at this, when I'm drawing and I draw this basic distance here, I'm aiming to try and say that this is a 3 to 5 block PR interval. So the PR interval is within that 3 to 5 block range. And since I'm drawing it, I'll tell you right here. We'll just say it's 4 block PR interval. Fits right in the middle of our range. The R to R is regular. Again, hand drawn. This one's actually pretty good. I'd say if anything, maybe this one's a little longer than the others. It looks like it might have been slowing down slightly, but not dramatically. So the R to R interval is essentially regular. It's consistent. I don't have two that are real close together and two that are really far apart. So it's a pretty consistent R to R interval. And if this was a 6-second strip, we count out, I've got 7 beats drawn here, so that would be a rate of 70. With a rate of 70, QRS is narrow, P waves are upright, round, symmetric, PR ratio is 1-to-1, PR intervals 3 to 5 small blocks, R to R is regular, and the rate's 70. That's just a simple normal sinus rhythm. Again, we're taking some time to review this after the midterm and just kind of get started on this new category. Now, if I drew one that looked like this, looking at this rhythm, take a few seconds, pause it, and answer your questions, and then come back. Okay, so the QRSs on here are still narrow. I have P waves, and they are upright, but they're pretty much embedded right in within the QRS here. So PR ratio, though, is 1-to-1. Every time I have a QRS, I have a P wave in front of it. Every time I have a P wave, I have a QRS that follows. But the PR interval here, if you look, again, hand-drawn, you don't have the grid, humor me and say this is about a 1 to 1.5 block PR interval. Well, that's too close, and we talked through that in junctional rhythms and said that you can't get a beat starting at the sinus node to get all the way down to the ventricles in less than that roughly 120 milliseconds. If the rate gets really fast, you might be able to get by with like a 2.5 block PR interval, but you're not going to be able to really say with a slower rate like this. Again, we've got 6 beats here, so the rate's 60. Slower rate like this, you're not going to have PR intervals that are less than 2 blocks. It's just not going to happen without that beat generating from the junction. So this is the equivalent of our late P waves, and therefore that would be a junctional rhythm. The reason I drew these two examples to kind of start us off, this one up here is a normal PR interval, so this is a sinus rhythm. This one is a too short PR interval, therefore that is a junctional rhythm. Now what happens if we get the opposite case here? So let me draw one of these. And I apologize, this takes a little while and it's not going to be spot on perfect, but it gives you an idea. Now, I did dip below the line here a little bit. I'll tell you what, not so great at erasing, but let's go ahead and just kind of fudge that and clear that up a little. All right, so now go ahead, take a few seconds, and work your way through all the different questions on here, and then unpause when you're ready. So that one looks maybe a little borderline wide. That one's not so bad. And then I got a couple narrow. But the shapes and the design on these QRSs are essentially consistent throughout. So I've got narrow QRSs. I do have P waves, and the P waves are upright. So the P waves being upright here are nice and clean. The PR ratio, well, P wave QRS, P wave QRS, P wave QRS, P wave QRS. So it's still 1-to-1 PR ratio. But now look at the PR interval. Today, and again with this series of lectures, you might be watching them over several days, but with this session here, the PR interval is consistent. That becomes very important. If you take a look at this, pretty close. They're essentially the same distance. I don't have a PR interval like this that's kind of a medium length and then one that's right on top of the QRS and then a big long one. I don't have variations like that. It's essentially the same distance PR interval each time. So consistency becomes very important. The fact that we have a 1-to-1 PR ratio becomes very important with this, and you'll see that as we go through the other types of blocks. However, if you look at the PR interval, well, if I told you that's a 3-block or 4-block PR interval, and that's like a 1.5-block PR interval, this is maybe a 4 or 5, or I'm sorry, this is like a 6 or 7-block PR interval. So this is a really long one. It's basically twice as long as our sinus rhythm here. So 6, 7 blocks long. And that falls outside of our norm. If the PR interval is consistent but short all the time there, you got that 1-to-1, but they're all short, that's a junctional rhythm. Well, if this is extended and it goes beyond that length, then what we have is something different. Well, when we talked about junctional rhythms, I discussed that if I were coming from Columbus over here to Dayton, it's roughly 65 miles or so, give or take a few miles, but 60, 65 miles. So if I come from the very, very west edge of Columbus and get to downtown Dayton, it's probably about 65, 68 miles. And take the highway, get there. It's not going to be possible for me to get there in 30 minutes. Yeah, if I got a rocket car or something like that, but I don't. Just driving normally, you're not going to be able to get there that fast. However, if I told you it took me 2 hours to get here from Columbus to Dayton, that kind of makes sense. And for those of you who have driven back and forth between Columbus and Dayton, you probably have experienced this at one time or another. There's construction on I-70 and things just get delayed. So there's some kind of a delay in the traffic conduction between the atria and the ventricles in this particular case. And the way that we would describe this, now, this is where things get a little bit crazy in terms of the name of this rhythm. So if I take this rhythm right here, all right, sorry about the phone interruption there, folks, but we're back in, and I wanted to give you the name for this. So these rhythms still originated. They've got a P wave with an upright P wave, upright round symmetric P waves. And they still generate actually at the sinus node. So the sinus node fires right at the beginning here of the QRS, or of the P wave. Then the atria depolarize. And then there's that extended pause here. So we have to kind of describe what's happening. And then you've got a narrow QRS. So, and you would, if I wasn't hand drawing these, you'd have a T wave as well. But essentially, we've got a rate, R is regular, we got a rate of 40 on this. And if I were going to describe this, well, all the boxes are checked. It's an upright narrow QRS. P waves are upright, round, symmetric. PR ratio is 1-to-1. PR interval is too long, so we're going to get into how do we explain that. And the R to R is regular. The rate is 40. So the name that I'd use, and I'm going to write this over here, and I'm only talking about this bottom rhythm, but this would be sinus bradycardia and it's a rate of 40, so it'd be a slow rate. So it's sinus bradycardia. But we have to deal with that long PR interval. This is junctional. This did not actually start at the sinus node. The sinus node caused the atria to depolarize, but the ventricles were caused to depolarize by the AV junction. So let me go ahead and just fill that in here as well. This is a junctional rhythm, and if you remember again, that's a junctional escape rhythm. And this one up here would be a sinus. Actually, I need to put the normal sinus, sorry it's a little sloppy, rhythm. So sinus bradycardia here. However, what we're going to do is we're going to say this is with a atrio, and I use that A appropriately, ventricular block. So, sinus bradycardia with an atrioventricular block. However, we have to kind of describe the type of atrioventricular block. You're going to learn several here. So, this is called a first degree. So, make that a little more of an S. So, sinus rhythm with a first degree atrioventricular block. And you can see I didn't write this the cleanest. That's not the greatest penmanship. My grade school teachers would be yelling at me. But essentially, sinus bradycardia with a first degree atrioventricular block. There's not too many docs and nurses that are going to write all this stuff out. So we'll start abbreviating a little bit. Now, normal sinus rhythm, we can abbreviate that one NSR. And as long as we know that we're talking about a heart rate, that could be like National Science Reservation or something like that in a different context. But we're talking about a heart rhythm, it's normal sinus rhythm. And a junctional rhythm could be junctional rhythm or junctional escape rhythm. So there's a bunch of different ways you can kind of write some of these things. So what I can come down here is sinus bradycardia. We're going to abbreviate that SB. So the abbreviations here in the lectures or in other classes, you may learn some abbreviations. One that you'll find very helpful here is with, they use a lowercase letter C with a line over it, so it looks kind of like the long vowels. You know how you have A with the double dots, and that means like an A sound instead of an A sound, but A with the line over it would mean a long A. It's the pronounced out vowel. So for this, what I'm going to do is put that C with a line over it. So that's sinus bradycardia with, well, first degree. How would we abbreviate that? How about first degree? And to be honest, atrioventricular block, when we're talking about something with that degree symbol here, that's understood. So sinus bradycardia with a first degree AV block, you could write this out, but SB with 1 degree is a fairly reasonable way of describing what this is. Now, if my heart rate were 70, for example, even with that long interval, it's very possible to have a rate of like 70 or 80, then it would be sinus rhythm, or SR, with first degree. If the rate actually got up as far as 110 or 120, that's also possible as long as the PR interval is consistently over the 5 blocks. So it's like 6-7 block PR interval. You'd have sinus tachycardia, or ST, with a first degree AV block. And it's going to be fairly rare, if ever, that you will see an SVT level. So you won't typically see it. Once it gets, you can't have this big long gap in the PR interval and actually have a rate over 150. There's just not really enough room for that to happen. So you're not going to see sinus SVT with first degree block virtually ever. So sinus brady, sinus rhythm, sinus tach with a first degree block. first degree block for the purposes of our testing and things, I'm okay if you just call it a first degree block. That's fine. What you will find is the sinus Brady, though, is helpful because it tells you what the rate is. And we're going to discuss management before too long here. And as I talk about manage with you, I want to explain when do we need to treat somebody. If they have a sinus rhythm with a first degree AV block, I don't care. As a paramedic, that's not an emergent concern. Honestly, if they have a sinus bradycardia, a rate of 40 here, I'm concerned about the fact that their heart rate's down to 40. So I'm going to do some things in my management to try and help increase that heart rate and improve their cardiac output. But I'm not real worried about them unless they're having symptoms. And most of the time it's the symptoms that I'm kind of worried about. But I can give them something to help increase the heart rate. If it's slightly tachycardic, that rate of 100 to 150, I really don't need to do anything about it at all. So there's all different kinds of things that can kind of crank somebody's heart rate up a bit. If they've been taking medications, that can do it. Just simply taking energy drinks, the monster drinks, or drinking a lot of coffee or things like that, getting anxious, you're in the hospital and you see the bill for the treatment, it can very easily get yourself on up there. So sinus Brady with a first degree block, probably relatively minor treatment, try and increase that heart rate a little bit. Sinus tach with a first degree block, if it's under 150, we don't even need to worry about it from an emergency standpoint. What will happen is the docs and a cardiologist, they would refer this person to a cardiologist, and I like to lump patients into one of several categories. You've got the category 1, which is there's either nothing wrong with you, you have a perfectly normal rhythm. That's going to be this one right here. And in that case, I don't really care. I don't have to do anything with it. If it's a slight abnormality, it's not dangerous, you're in category 1. You're fine. I don't need to worry about anything unless you have symptoms, in which case then I treat the symptoms. Category 2 is where you have an abnormal rhythm. So that's going to qualify as either or both of these. There's an abnormal rhythm, but it's not really dangerous. It's just something that we want to let the cardiologist know. So if I see a normal rhythm, I'm not really going to do much of anything on that patient that entire day. If I see an abnormal rhythm, but it's not dangerous and the patient's asymptomatic, so even with a heart rate of 40, there's probably several of you in there that had your heart rate was in the upper 40s or low 50s. Quite often in these classes, when we hook people up to the monitors, we'll see that there's patients that have a heart rate that's 52. If you're fine, there's nothing I need to do for it. We'll call it a Dr. Phil moment. How's it working for you? If your heart rate is giving you what you need at a rate of 40-something or 50-something, I'm not going to do anything to mess with that. That's what your body needs. We'll call you sinus bradycardia, but it's not dangerous. It's not problematic. Then you get into the third categories where some of those ventricular rhythms can get a little bit dicey and a little bit dangerous. The ventricular rhythms on there might consider to be a problem, or if I have a slow heart rate and this person is passing out, I can't get them to stay awake for me, and we're used to them having a heart rate of 70 or 80 and now it's down to 40, it's half their normal heart rate, and they're not staying awake or their blood pressure is really low, that's problematic. I need to do some work on them. They start falling up into this third category of people, which I need to do some management because this person is working on trying to die or their function is not up to where it should be. And finally, this last category would be dead people. So any of these rhythms, for that matter, if I have the patient has no pulse whatsoever, they're not breathing, they're unresponsive, and they're pulseless, I have to do CPR. I have to do a lot of invasive care to try and give this person a chance at life. And we'll see as we discuss management that it doesn't really matter what the rhythm shows. Doing CPR here soon, so when you do the CPR lessons, you're going to find that, hey, this is a dangerous situation. I mean, the person is essentially dead, and we're trying to keep them alive. But right there is your description of what are the rules of a sinus rhythm with a first degree block. Everything fits sinus all the way down there. Your P waves will be upright. And they'll usually be round and symmetric, but they'll at least be upright. PR ratio is still 1-to-1. That's a critical rule. PR interval is consistent. That's very important, but it's too long. So greater than 5 blocks on a consistent basis. Now 5.1 blocks, I'll probably look the other way. But if it's 6, 7, 8, 9 blocks on a regular basis, consistently 7, 7, 7, 7.5, 7, 7, 7, 7.5, that's a long PR interval. That's a first degree block. So that covers our first degree blocks. We're going to move on into the other types of blocks, and then I'll do some discussion. Now that we've done some of this background, the others should go kind of quick and smooth. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to review this video again. I refer you to your textbook and ask questions in class, or feel free to shoot me an email at any time.